So in part one, we went over the full story of the Tower of Joy and discussed how Jon Snow is somehow linked to Ashara Dane. This makes me ask, where's the A in R plus L equals J? But that's not the only problem with this popular theory. The other is the promise. We know that Ned is haunted by a promise that he makes Lyanna, and over the course of a Game of Thrones, this haunting escalates. Ned thinks about the promise once in the Crypts of Winterfell and once along the King's Road. Both times are with Robert discussing Lyanna. But once Ned gets to King's Landing, he starts having disturbing dreams about the promise. Now, it's unclear who's causing him to have these dreams, whether his own subconscious, or Bloodraven, or Quaithe, or Marwyn. But what's certain is that this promise would have nothing to do with Jon Snow. Ned and Jon's relationship throughout a Game of Thrones is fairly static. Jon gets sent to the Wall, and that's it. Ned has no ability to change his relationship with Jon once he's in King's Landing. So haunting Ned with dreams about Jon would be pointless unless you're trying to get Ned to leave the city and head to the Wall. The dreams have the exact opposite effect on Ned. They cause Ned to stay in King's Landing. Keep in mind that shortly before Ned has his first fever dream, he has a huge argument with Robert about Daenerys. Robert wants Daenerys killed, and Ned doesn't. Ned quits his hand and then decides he wants to go back to Winterfell, or maybe stop by Dragonstone and talk to Stannis. However, he gets injured in a fight with Jaime Lannister, has a fever dream about the tower, and all of a sudden he wants to stay. So whatever the promise is, it has something to do with what's going on in King's Landing. Now it seems that the promise has something to do with protecting a child. After all, Lyanna made it from a bed of blood, and Ned thinks about it when holding a baby bastard at a whorehouse. And whatever the promise was, Ned thinks he failed at it, as he dreams of broken promises in his dungeon. Again, this would make no sense if it had anything to do with Jon Snow, as Ned successfully protected Jon, and Jon is still safe at the Wall. There's no reason at all to be haunted. The only child that Ned failed at protecting was Daenerys. In fact, Ned thinks about the promise again when Robert brings up Daenerys on his deathbed. However, Varys says that the issue is already done with and the ravens have flown. So overall, the promise makes a lot more sense if it were about Daenerys. Ned has a reason to be haunted about it, has a reason to stay in King's Landing about it, and has a reason to feel that he failed at it. So what are we saying here? R plus L equals D? How is that even possible? Wasn't Daenerys born on Dragonstone? Actually, we don't really know anything about Daenerys' early childhood. Our only source on the matter is Viserys. From what Viserys has told her, Daenerys believes that she was conceived right before the sack of King's Landing, was born on Dragonstone, and then moved to Braavos to live in the house with the Red Door. Dany only has foggy memories of the House of the Red Door, but she definitely remembers a lemon tree outside of her window. But here's the thing, there are no lemon trees in Braavos. Braavos is a cold, windy, and treeless place, so Viserys has lied to Daenerys about her childhood for some reason. And Quaithe keeps wanting Daenerys to remember who she is for some reason. Not to mention all of the weird Red Door dreams Quaithe keeps sending her. But beyond Ned's association of the promise with Daenerys, there's one other thing that makes me think that Daenerys was at the Tower of Joy. Ned weirdly pulls the Tower of Joy down single-handedly. This is a Herculean task, even if we assume the tower were only a couple stories and that he was using horses. Maybe Howland used magic, but the text says that Ned did it. So how can one person possibly bring down a Tower of Secrets? Well, the Tower of Joy is not the only tower to go down in our story. Cersei brings down the Tower of the Hand, and she does so quite easily with the use of wildfire. So if Ned found some wildfire in the base of the tower, he'd be able to do the same. Now you may ask, why would there be wildfire at the Tower of Joy? And I would reply, why wouldn't there be? Aerion Targaryen drank wildfire thinking it would transform him into a dragon. And then we have Egg and his son who burned up at Summerhall. The Mad King Aerys placed wildfire all around King's Landing and hoped in the Inferno he would be transformed into a dragon. And of course Daenerys walked right into a fiery pyre. The point being, more often than not, Targaryens want to create a big, flaming inferno. And the pyromancers of King's Landing tell Tyrion that some of Aerys' wildfire went missing. Now I know what you're thinking, burning Lyanna and a baby? Isn't that awfully cruel? Well, let's remember that the Azor Ahai legend involves the killing of his wife. And let's remember that when prophecy-obsessed Maester Aemon met prophecy-obsessed Melisandre, he naturally assumed that she'd be burning babies. And let's remember that Daenerys seems to have actually been part of hatching dragons. So Rhaegar wanting the Tower of Joy to go up in flames is not very far-fetched. In fact, it's exactly what you'd expect from a Targaryen. But everybody seems to really like Rhaegar. Would he really do that? Let's remember that we don't actually know very much about Rhaegar, but we do know a lot about Egg. He was a great guy, and he still died in a fiery inferno. Rhaegar was one secretive dude, and it's said that no one really knew him. But what about Ned? I mean, Ned doesn't seem to like Rhaegar, but he doesn't seem to hate him either. Shouldn't he? Let's remember that Ned has some serious holes in his memory regarding the Tower of Joy and Rhaegar. Whether these holes are from magic or from trauma is unknown, but no matter what you believe happened at the tower, it's very clear that Ned hasn't put all of the pieces together. Okay, if R plus L equals D, what about Jon? Quite obviously, in Ice and Fire, Jon and Daenerys are parallel characters. Jon is on the ice front, associated with the old gods, and Daenerys is on the fire front, associated with the red god. So if we assume that Rhaegar, with all of his rubies, is trying to birth a savior for the red god, who's trying to do anything for the old gods? And this brings us back to Howland Reed. As I hinted on before, Howland Reed's presence at the Harrenhal tourney is awfully suspicious. He just so happens to stumble upon the tourney while on a quest to the Isle of Faces. He later is such a badass fighter that he can go up against Kingsguard, and yet he gets his ass kicked by a bunch of 15-year-old squires? It seems that Howland wanted to meet the Starks, and pretending to get his ass kicked in front of Lyanna was part of his plan. What plan is that? Well, after making friends with the Starks, he spends an evening staring at Ashara Dane. Now, besides making Howland look like a creeper, this staring would also cause the Starks to notice Ashara as well. Sure enough, Ned ends up wanting to dance with Ashara, but is too shy, so Brandon has to go talk to her. Now, Ashara is a strong, liberated Dornish woman, so put yourself in her position. Would you rather have the shy, meek Ned, or the strong, confident Brandon? But even if Ashara were down to fuck Ned, she couldn't, as Howland cockblocks him for the rest of the evening. What do I mean? Well, Howland then stares at the squires who beat him up earlier. This again causes the Starks to take notice. Benjen and Lyanna start scheming with their Night of the Laughing Tree plan, while Ned seems to keep Howland company. He even offers Howland a place in his tent. Now, it should be noted that an open spot in Ned's tent means he's not getting down with Ashara Dane. It should also be noted that Brandon is now not in the story. With Brandon being known as a womanizer, and Barristan Selmy saying Ashara looked to Stark, and with the other three Stark children being busy, it seems that it was Brandon and Ashara getting down. Howland actually seems to have nudged Brandon in Ashara's direction and freed him up from his siblings with nothing more than a few haunting stares. And while most people are focused on the romance between Rhaegar and Lyanna beginning at Harrenhal, it's balanced by the romance of Brandon and Ashara. But when did Brandon and Ashara have time to conceive a child during the war? Well, if you remember, Brandon goes to King's Landing at the very beginning of the war. He's arrested and eventually executed. Ashara was employed as Elya's handmaiden in King's Landing, so the two are in the same place. And while Ashara could have easily met Brandon right before he made it to King's Landing, there's something very fitting about Ashara and Brandon conceiving a child in a dungeon. Keep in mind, the story of Bale the Bard is a story about a bard who kidnaps Lady Stark and produces a child. It's another one of these stories that has all the elements of our current story, just jumbled around. For example, Rhaegar is a bard who steals Lady Stark. Lady Stark's father happens to be named Brandon, and she ends up committing suicide in the end like Ashara, though this time from a tower rather than a cliff. Now in the story, Lady Stark and the bard end up conceiving a child in the crypts beneath Winterfell. So Brandon and Ashara conceiving a child in a dungeon would parallel this quite well. But how Brandon and Ashara conceived a child isn't that important, just that they did. Now we have one ice and fire couple producing a fire child, and another ice and fire couple producing an ice child. Lyanna and Brandon have a balance. They both find their love at Harrenhal, and they both end up in the crypts together. Now, as you may have guessed, there must be a baby swap at Starfall for this to work out. But the swap kind of makes sense. If Ned has a blonde baby, he can't exactly discreetly raise her as his own. Meanwhile, at the time, Ashara and Brandon's bastard happens to be the only heir to Starfall, or at least he can put in a pretty good claim for it. The text is ambiguous on who's older, Ashara or Edric Dane's father, so it's hard to say who would inherit Starfall under Dornish law, especially if Brandon and Ashara were secretly married in front of a heart tree. Nonetheless, these inheritance issues are always a headache, so Ned is doing a huge favor for House Dane by taking care of Jon as his own. And if Ashara agreed to fake her death and spirit Daenerys away, she's doing a huge favor for Ned. Now, if Jon is the son of Brandon, he may think he has a claim to Winterfell, so Luwin is doing a real favor to Robb by sending him to the Wall. And while Viserys should have claim over his niece, he weakens Daenerys' claim even more by making her his younger sister. At the same time, as his younger sister, there's no question of legitimacy, so she can be married off. So by adjusting the equation to R plus L equals D, B plus A equals J, we can explain a lot more of the story. But does this fit in the timeline? And what about the Kingsguard? And we'll talk about those in part 3.